The rain had fallen all through the night, a soft, relentless whisper against the windows of Whitmore Manor. The house, once radiant with laughter and candlelight, now carried the quiet heaviness of decline. Shadows clung to the corners, and the tapestries, faded by time, seemed to sigh with every draught that swept through the halls. Lady Arabella Whitmore stood at her bedroom window, her fingers lightly brushing the frost along the glass pane. Beyond the misted garden, dawn had not yet broken. The world was gray and still. She heard the carriage wheels crunching on the gravel below, an unwelcome sound that marked the beginning of her new life. Her mother's voice echoed faintly from the corridor. "Arabella, my dear, are you dressed? His Grace's solicitor will arrive within the hour. We mustn't appear unprepared." Arabella closed her eyes. His Grace's solicitor. Even now, the words sounded strange, unreal, as though belonging to some other woman's life. She had never met the man she was to marry, the Duke of Hawthorne, though she knew the rumors well enough. Cold, unyielding. The Duke who had turned his back on society after his brother's death, who preferred the solitude of his northern estate to the gaiety of London. Arabella sighed softly. A convenient match, her father had called it. Though what convenience there could be in marrying a stranger to settle another man's debts was beyond her comprehension. The door creaked open. Lady Whitmore entered, elegant even in worry, her silver hair pinned with precision. "You look pale, my darling," she murmured, touching her daughter's cheek. "I know this is sudden, but we have no choice. The creditors grow impatient, and your father, I know." Arabella interrupted gently. "Please, do not speak of it." Her voice trembled, but her eyes did not. "If my marriage can preserve Whitmore Manor, then I shall do what duty demands." Her mother's eyes glistened with tears, pride and guilt mingling in one sorrowful expression. "You have your grandmother's strength," she whispered. "But I wish it were otherwise." Moments later, the solicitor arrived, Mr. Alden, a man of neat spectacles and even neater manners. He laid a thick parchment upon the drawing-room table, its wax seal glinting red in the pale morning light. "The terms are simple, my lady," he began. "His Grace requires discretion and compliance in all matters pertaining to the estate. In return, your dowry will settle your father's accounts, and your mother shall remain at Whitmore Manor under his protection." Arabella listened in silence. Her hands were clasped in her lap, her knuckles pale against the ivory lace of her gown. "And in all this, Mr. Alden," she asked quietly, "does His Grace express any personal preference? Or am I to assume this is a business transaction only?" The solicitor hesitated, a brief flicker of discomfort. "His Grace is not a man easily understood, my lady, but he values loyalty and honesty." Arabella smiled faintly, though it did not reach her eyes. "Then perhaps we shall suit each other perfectly." The wedding took place 3 weeks later, beneath the pale gold arches of St. George's Chapel. The ceremony was brief, almost austere, attended only by family, a handful of curious nobles, and the ever-watchful eyes of society. The Duke of Hawthorne stood tall and composed beside her. His features were striking but unreadable, a man carved from restraint itself. When he spoke his vows, his tone was calm, deliberate, devoid of affection but not of sincerity. Arabella repeated hers in a voice steady as a prayer, though her heart trembled beneath her corseted bodice. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, the Duke inclined his head slightly, an acknowledgement, nothing more. No kiss, no warmth, only the cold weight of duty settling upon them both. That evening, as the carriages carried them toward Hawthorne Hall, Arabella gazed out the window at the endless expanse of countryside. The rain had returned, tracing silver lines down the glass. The silence between her and her husband was profound, not awkward, but measured, as if they both understood that words might only disturb the fragile peace of formality. At last, the Duke spoke. "I trust you found the ceremony tolerable." His voice was low, smooth, and impossibly composed. Arabella turned to him. "As tolerable as such arrangements can be, Your Grace." A faint glimmer of something, perhaps amusement, perhaps respect, touched his expression. "You may call me Sebastian, if you wish. Titles are a tiresome formality within one's own carriage." "Then you must call me Arabella," she replied. "If we are to live as strangers, let us at least be polite ones." He studied her for a moment longer than comfort allowed, then looked away. "You have courage," he said softly. "That may serve you well at Hawthorne Hall." The great manor rose out of the mist, like something half forgotten by time. Tall stone walls, ivy-clad and weathered, loomed over manicured lawns and sleeping fountains. Inside, the halls stretched wide and echoing, filled with portraits of proud, unsmiling ancestors. Arabella followed the Duke through the entrance, her slippered steps echoing against marble. Servants bowed as they passed, their eyes curious but disciplined. "This will be your wing," the Duke said at last, pausing before a grand oak door. "I shall reside in the west chambers. You will find Hawthorne Hall quiet. I prefer solitude, and I suspect you might as well." Arabella tilted her head slightly. "And if I do not?" He turned to face her, his gaze sharp yet strangely weary. "Then, my lady, I hope you are patient enough to teach me the art of conversation again." For the first time that day, a genuine smile touched her lips. "Perhaps," she said softly, "we might both learn." That night, she stood before her bedroom mirror, the flickering candlelight brushing her reflection with gold. She thought of her mother's tears, of her father's silence, of the cold beauty of the man she had married. And somewhere deep within her heart, beneath the layers of resignation and pride, a question stirred. Could a marriage built on duty ever awaken into love? Beyond the window, thunder rolled across the hills, echoing the restlessness she dared not name. Hawthorne Hall was unlike any place Lady Arabella Whitmore had ever known. Its grandeur, though undeniable, carried a stillness that spoke more of absence than splendor. The corridors were long and hushed, lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow her with quiet judgment. Even the servants moved as though their footsteps might disturb a ghost. On her first morning, Arabella awoke to a gray light creeping across the canopy of her bed. The rain had not yet ceased. Somewhere far below, the distant toll of the chapel bell marked 7 o'clock, a sound both beautiful and mournful. Her maid, young Clara, entered with a bow. "Good morning, my lady. His Grace requests that breakfast be served in the east dining room." Arabella blinked. "Requests?" she repeated softly, rising from her bed. "Not commands?" "I am surprised." Clara's lips curved faintly. "His Grace is not a man given to cruelty, my lady. Only to silence." Arabella smiled slightly. "Then perhaps silence is the only language we shall share." She dressed simply, a pale lavender morning gown, with lace sleeves, and descended to the east dining room. The hallways, with their heavy draperies and endless mirrors, seemed designed to swallow sound. Every step she took echoed faintly, like a whisper that didn't belong. When she entered, the Duke was already seated at the far end of the long table, reading a folded newspaper. The sight of him, calm, composed, unreadable, stirred something undefinable in her chest. "Good morning, Your Grace," she greeted politely. He looked up, setting the paper aside. "Good morning, Arabella." His tone was even, his expression formal but not unkind. "I trust you slept well." "Well enough, thank you," she replied. "The house is remarkably quiet." "That is by design," he said simply. "Peace is a rare commodity in this world." She hesitated before sitting. "And yet," she said carefully, "too much peace can feel a little like loneliness." For a brief moment, his eyes flickered. A shadow, quickly hidden. "Perhaps," he murmured, "though I have made peace with solitude. It is far easier to control than company." Arabella tilted her head. "Do you always seek control, Your Grace?" A faint ghost of a smile crossed his lips. "Always," he said. "It prevents disappointment." Over the following days, Arabella came to understand what Clara had meant. The Duke was not cruel, nor even distant in manner, merely quiet, deliberate, contained. He rose early, spent long hours in his study or on horseback, and rarely joined her for meals. At first, she resented his absence. Then, slowly, she began to observe him instead, the way he paused by the window each morning before riding out, as though searching for something he had long lost, the way his hand tightened around the reins. Not from anger, but restraint. She found herself curious. And curiosity, she realized, was a dangerous beginning. One afternoon, unable to bear the oppressive silence any longer, Arabella wandered into the west wing, his side of the manor. The air there was colder, heavier. The light filtered through tall stained windows that painted the walls in muted gold and crimson. She paused before a door that stood slightly ajar. From within came the faint scent of tobacco and old leather. Her hand hesitated on the latch, but before she could withdraw, a voice spoke. "You may enter, Lady Arabella." The Duke sat by the fireplace, a book open in his lap. The flames cast his profile in sharp relief, a face both beautiful and burdened. She stepped inside. "Forgive me. I did not mean to intrude. Curiosity is no crime," he replied, closing the book. "Though this room rarely welcomes company." "Then perhaps it should," she said softly, glancing around. "It feels lonely." He studied her in silence. "You do not like loneliness, do you?" "I have had enough of it," she replied honestly. "Since childhood, it has been my most constant companion." He looked into the fire. "Then you understand it better than most." Arabella hesitated. "If I may be so bold, Your Grace, what made you so fond of solitude?" A long pause followed, the kind that stretches, fragile and unspoken. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reluctant. "My brother," he said, "he died here, in this house. I was meant to protect him. I failed." The words hung in the air, heavy as stone. Arabella's breath caught. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I did not know. Few do." His gaze lifted to hers, dark and steady. "Since then, I have found silence easier than conversation. It demands nothing of me." She took a step closer, her voice gentle. "And yet silence also gives nothing back." Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, perhaps less, something fragile flickered between them. Not affection, not yet, but understanding. The first thread of something human and real. He looked away. "You are unusually perceptive for a woman raised among London's frivolities." She smiled faintly. "And you are unusually kind for a man said to have no heart." His lips curved, barely. "Be careful, my lady. You may make me forget that reputation." "Would that be such a tragedy?" she asked softly. He did not answer. That evening, Arabella lingered in her chamber, the fire burning low. The rain, constant companion of her arrival, now fell more softly, a rhythm almost tender. She thought of his eyes, the depth of his voice, the loneliness hidden behind the title. She did not love him, not yet. But for the first time, she wished she might someday try. In the hallway beyond, she heard his footsteps pause outside her door. A long silence followed. Then, without a word, the footsteps retreated. Arabella turned toward the dying fire, her heart inexplicably aching. The arrival of spring brought with it the inevitable. Invitations to every ball, soiree, and garden party within 50 miles of London. The Hawthorne name, once whispered with intrigue, was again being spoken with a mix of fascination and envy. The Duke and Duchess had begun to appear together in public, if only for appearances, and society, in its usual hunger for stories, saw this as the prelude to reconciliation. Lady Arabella had learned the art of composure. She could smile with her lips while her eyes betrayed nothing. Her gowns were always perfectly chosen, her dance steps effortless, her wit precise. But in the quiet moments between each waltz, her thoughts betrayed her, always drawn to the man who stood across the room, watching her as though she were a puzzle he could never solve. Sebastian, the Duke of Hawthorne, was a man both admired and feared. In conversation, he was measured; in argument, impenetrable. Yet tonight, beneath the glittering chandeliers of the Duchess of Beaumont's grand masquerade, there was something unguarded in his gaze. Perhaps it was the mask, a golden thing that covered half his face, that allowed him the freedom to look at his wife as he wished to, without the burden of his title or reputation. "Your Grace," Arabella greeted as he approached her, her tone polite but cool. "I would not have expected you to join the masquerade. I thought such frivolities beneath you." He smiled faintly, the corner of his mouth curving just enough to unsettle her. Even a duke must yield to curiosity. Duchess. Especially when the object of curiosity wears emerald silk. Her lips parted slightly, her composure faltering just for a heartbeat. "Then you admit curiosity still lingers in your cold heart." He stepped closer, close enough that the faint scent of his cologne, cedar and smoke, reached her. "You would be surprised what warmth a cold heart can conceal." Arabella turned away before he could see her blush. "Then perhaps you should unmask, Your Grace, and let the world see this transformation." He chuckled softly. "Not tonight. Tonight I wish to be no duke at all, just a man who may dance with his wife without the weight of 1,000 eyes." She looked up then, meeting his gaze through her own delicate mask of black lace. "A man who never dances, now wishes to dance?" she teased. "Only with one woman," he said quietly. The orchestra swelled, and before she could reply, he extended his hand. She hesitated only a moment before placing her gloved fingers in his. The warmth of his touch startled her, steady, firm, and alive with something she could not name. As they moved to the center of the ballroom, whispers rose like soft wind among the crowd. The Duke of Hawthorne dancing with his wife, such a sight was a story in itself. The waltz began. Their movements were perfect, but what stirred the most attention was not their grace, it was the way they looked at one another. To an outsider, it might seem like indifference, but to those who knew better, there was a tension, a question left unanswered in every turn. "You've changed," Arabella murmured as they circled one another. "Or perhaps you've begun to see what I am," he replied. "And what are you, Sebastian?" Her voice trembled as she said his name aloud for the first time in months. "A man who made a grave mistake," he said. "A man trying to undo 7 years of silence." The music carried them forward before she could respond. He twirled her once, twice, then held her hand longer than propriety allowed when the waltz came to its close. When the dance ended, Arabella curtsied. "And what mistake would that be, Your Grace?" she asked softly, though she feared his answer. He looked down at her, his voice barely a whisper. "Letting the only woman I ever truly loved believe she was unloved." Later that night, as the masquerade drew to its glittering end, Arabella stood alone on the balcony, the moonlight turning her silk gown silver. The cool air brushed against her skin, yet her heart felt aflame. She heard his footsteps behind her but did not turn. "You should not be alone," Sebastian said quietly. "I've been alone for 7 years, my lord," she replied without looking at him. "I believe I've mastered it." He exhaled softly. "Then I pity the man who taught you how." She turned then, eyes bright with restrained pain. "You are that man, Sebastian. You and your perfect silences." For a long moment, neither spoke. The distance between them felt both unbearable and fragile, like a thread that could either bind or break. Finally, he stepped forward, his voice low and steady. "I cannot change what has been done, but I can beg you to believe that the man standing before you tonight is not the one who wed you 7 years ago. That man was a coward. This one," he hesitated, searching her eyes, "has learned what it means to lose something irreplaceable." Arabella looked at him for a long, silent moment. Her expression softened, though her tone remained measured. "Words are easy, my lord," she said, "but hearts remember differently." He bowed his head. "Then let me spend the rest of my days convincing yours to forget." Inside, the orchestra played one final tune. The Duchess of Hawthorne remained on the balcony, the Duke standing beside her, not as strangers, but not yet as lovers. Between them lingered the promise of something fragile, something neither could name, but both feared to lose again. The night had not ended in reconciliation, but it had begun something dangerously close to hope. The morning after the masquerade dawned softly, with mist lying low across the gardens of Hawthorne Manor. The air was heavy with the scent of rain and rosewood, the sort of morning that felt like an unfinished letter, waiting for a confession that might never be written. Arabella sat at her writing desk, a quill poised between trembling fingers. Before her lay a half-finished letter, the ink smudged where tears had fallen during the night. "My lord, I write not to reproach, but to remember. There was a time when I dreamt our silence would one day turn into understanding. Perhaps it still might, if only we dared to speak." She stopped there, unable to write more. The words felt too raw, too dangerous. To send such a letter would mean admitting that her heart, despite every wound and cold evening, still beat in rhythm with his name. With a sigh, she folded the page and tucked it into the drawer beside the other unsent letters. There were many now, 7 years' worth of unspoken words, sealed away like ghosts. Downstairs, the Duke was in his study, standing by the window where the fog blurred the edge of the rose garden. He had not slept. The memory of their dance haunted him, the feel of her hand in his, the way her voice had trembled when she said his name, Sebastian. He had forgotten how dangerous his own name could sound in her mouth. The Duke of Hawthorne was not a man easily swayed by sentiment, but this was something else. A gnawing ache that refused to be reasoned away. He turned when he heard a knock at the door. It was Lord Ashcombe, his oldest friend, and one of the few men who could enter unannounced. "You look dreadful," Ashcombe observed with an amused smile. "Has marriage finally bested the great Duke of Hawthorne?" Sebastian poured himself a glass of brandy. "Marriage bested me long ago. I am merely suffering the consequences." Ashcombe studied him quietly. "You danced with her last night. All of London is talking. I am aware," Sebastian said dryly. "Then perhaps London is right," Ashcombe pressed. "Perhaps it is time to stop punishing her and yourself." Sebastian's hand tightened around the glass. "You speak as though love were something one could command." Ashcombe gave a soft chuckle. "No, but you command everything else, old friend. Surely you can command your heart to do the one thing it was made for." Sebastian looked down at his glass, his voice low. "It is not my heart I fear, it is hers." Later that afternoon, Arabella decided to walk through the gardens. The spring sunlight had broken through the clouds, casting a golden glow upon the dew-drenched petals. She carried a small book of poetry, though she scarcely read a word. As she wandered, she saw a familiar figure by the old fountain, the Duke, with his sleeves rolled, attempting to repair the cracked stone basin. The sight startled her. "You, my lord, appear uncommonly industrious," she said lightly. He turned, wiping his hands on a handkerchief. "The fountain has been neglected far too long, like many things in this house," she murmured before she could stop herself. He looked at her, then really looked, and something softened in his eyes. "You are not wrong, Arabella." It was the first time he had said her name in years. For a moment, neither moved. The sunlight fell between them like a veil. Then she spoke, her tone careful. "You danced well last night, for a man who claims indifference to society." "I found I could not refuse the invitation," he said simply. "Not when it came from you." Her heart fluttered, but she disguised it with a faint smile. "You flatter me, Your Grace." "I never learned how," he said softly. A silence followed, filled only by the soft trickle of water as the fountain began to run again. Arabella looked away. If only every broken thing could be so easily repaired. He stepped closer, the distance between them closing to a breath. "Some things can," he said, "if one has the courage to try." She wanted to believe him, wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance that years had carved between them. But before she could speak, a servant appeared at the garden gate with a message. "Your Grace, a courier has arrived from the Duchess of Marborne. She requests an urgent audience." Arabella drew back instantly, her mask of composure returning. "Duty calls, as ever," she said quietly. Sebastian hesitated, as though torn between his obligations and the fragile moment they had shared. "This conversation is not over," he said. She smiled faintly, though her eyes told another story. "Is it not? It has been ending for 7 years. That evening, Sebastian found himself pacing his study, the faint scent of her perfume still clinging to his thoughts. On the desk lay a letter, her letter. It had been mistakenly delivered with his morning correspondence, unsealed but unsigned. He knew he should not read it. Yet his hand disobeyed him. "My lord, I write not to reproach, but to remember." The words pierced him deeper than any accusation. He could see her in every line, the quiet courage, the restrained tenderness. And then, at the bottom, an unfinished sentence. "Perhaps it still might, if only we dared to speak." He set the letter down, his breath uneven. If only we dared to speak. He had spent 7 years building walls of silence, believing them to be protection. But now he saw them for what they were, prison bars of his own making. Without hesitation, he took a quill and began to write a reply. "My dearest Arabella, I have lived too long in the shadow of my own pride. If silence was my refuge, it has become my punishment. Know this: every day of distance has been one more day I have missed the sound of your laughter. You may not yet forgive me, but I shall not rest until I earn the right to try." He sealed the letter, intending to send it at once, but as he reached for the bell pull, his hand faltered. A strange fear seized him. What if she rejected it? What if his words only deepened the wound? And so, like hers, his letter too was left unsent. He placed it gently inside the drawer beside her old portrait, the one taken on their wedding day, when hope had not yet turned to sorrow. 2 letters now, lying in silence. 2 hearts, speaking only to parchment. That night, the manor was silent except for the whisper of the wind through the ivy. Arabella could not sleep. She rose, wrapped in her shawl, and walked the darkened corridors until she reached the library. There, by the firelight, she saw him, Sebastian, asleep in his chair, her letter still on the table beside him. Something in her chest broke. Quietly she approached, her hand trembling as she reached out and brushed the edge of the parchment. The sight of his face, peaceful, softened by sleep, was enough to undo her. This was not the Duke of society, not the cold, distant man she had married. This was the man she might have loved, if only pride had not kept them apart. She leaned down, whispering words she could never say in daylight. "I never stopped waiting for you." And then she slipped away, leaving only the faintest scent of roses in her wake. By morning, neither letter had been sent. But both hearts quietly, unknowingly had begun to write again. The following days passed in an uneasy quiet. The weather, as though mimicking the fragile mood within Hawthorne Manor, grew uncertain. Sunlight in the morning, rain by afternoon, and wind that rattled the windows long into the night. In that vast and echoing house, Lady Arabella and Duke Sebastian moved like ghosts bound to the same memory, brushing past one another in corridors, speaking informal courtesies that failed to hide the tremor beneath their words. Yet something had shifted, an invisible thread, pulled taut. Since the masquerade, the silence between them was no longer cold, it was alive, trembling with unspoken things. And that morning, Arabella sat in the library, pretending to read. The truth was that her thoughts wandered to the letter she had written, to the one she had found him sleeping beside. Had he read it? She wondered. Did he understand what I meant to say, what I could never say aloud? The rain began again, tapping softly against the windows. Outside, the rose garden was half drowned, the fountain gurgling beneath the downpour. The sound was oddly soothing, and yet she felt restless, as though something unfinished was calling her name. Her thoughts were interrupted by a quiet knock at the door. "Enter," she said, setting her book aside. It was Mrs. Dalton, the housekeeper, with a curtsy. "Your Grace, his lordship is in the stables. He asked that I inform you he'll be delayed for dinner." Arabella frowned. "In this weather? The man will drown before the horses do." Mrs. Dalton smiled faintly. "You know how he is when his mind is troubled." Arabella hesitated, glancing at the rain-slicked window. "Yes," she murmured. "I do." She stood, her decision already made. The stables were nearly empty when she arrived, the air thick with the smell of hay and storm. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the Duke, sleeves rolled and hair damp with rain, as he struggled to calm a restless mare. "Sebastian," she called over the thunder. He turned, startled, and for a moment simply stared. She looked radiant even in her worry, her shawl soaked, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "What in God's name are you doing out here?" he demanded, stepping toward her. "You'll catch your death." "And you?" she shot back. "You seem quite determined to meet yours wrestling horses in a thunderstorm." He gave a short, incredulous laugh. "Stubborn as ever." "And you?" she retorted. "As impossible as always." Their words clashed like lightning, but beneath the anger was something more: fear, longing, love in disguise. The storm outside roared louder, the rain drumming against the stable roof, until their voices were nearly lost in the sound. "I came because I was worried," she said finally, her voice trembling. "You've been distant again," he sighed, running a hand through his rain-soaked hair. "I've been many things, Arabella. Distant, proud, a fool. You forgot cruel," she said quietly. He looked at her sharply, the truth of it reflected in his eyes. "Yes," he said. "That too." There was silence then, the kind that weighs heavy between two people who have too much history to escape. Finally, she whispered, "You read it, didn't you?" "My letter." He froze. "I did." Her heart fluttered painfully. "And you said nothing." "I was afraid to," he admitted. "Afraid that if I spoke, you'd tell me there was nothing left to say." Arabella took a step closer, her voice breaking. "You should have spoken anyway." He laughed softly, a sound tinged with regret. "You ask that of a man who built his life upon silence." "Then break it," she said fiercely. "Break it now." Her challenge hung in the air between them, electric as the storm outside. He stared at her for a long, unbearable moment, his chest rising with words that had waited 7 years to be freed. "Arabella," he said, his voice raw, "I never stopped loving you, The words seemed to strike her harder than thunder. She stood frozen, every breath stolen from her chest. "You say that now?" she whispered. "After years of cold rooms and colder words." "Yes," he said, stepping closer. "Because I was too proud to say it then. Because I thought love was weakness. Because I thought you deserved someone better than the man I had become." She shook her head, tears mingling with the rain. "And yet, all I ever wanted was you. Not the Duke, not the estate, not the grandeur, just the man who held my hand once and looked at me like I was the only person in the world." Sebastian closed the distance between them. "Then forgive me for every day I made you feel unloved." Her eyes lifted to his, filled with trembling fire. "And if I can't, then let me spend the rest of my life trying to deserve it." He reached for her hand, and for a moment she did not pull away. The touch was tentative, like sunlight breaking through rain clouds. "I meant to write you a letter," he said softly. "1,000 times. I wrote one last night." Arabella looked at him with surprise. "And?" He smiled sadly. "I was too much the coward to send it." Something in her expression melted, then grief, tenderness, exhaustion. "Then perhaps," she whispered, "we are both cowards." "Perhaps," he said, "but not tonight." And before she could reply, he drew her closer slowly, reverently, as though afraid she might vanish if he moved too fast. The storm raged around them, but neither noticed. The moment their foreheads touched, it felt like the first breath after drowning. "I have loved you every day in silence," he murmured. "Allow me now to love you aloud." Her eyes closed, tears mingling with the rain. "Then speak," she whispered, "and never stop." He kissed her, then not with hunger, but with a tenderness so deep it felt like apology, confession, and promise all at once. The rain poured, the thunder cracked, and for the first time in 7 years, Hawthorne Manor was no longer silent. Later, when the storm had quieted and the air smelled of wet earth, they stood together at the stable door, watching the dawn break through gray clouds. "Do you think it will last?" she asked softly. He looked at her, his expression calm. "The rain? The peace?" she said. He smiled faintly. "Only if we choose it." She nodded slowly, her hand finding his once more. "Then let us choose it." And though the road ahead was still uncertain, for the first time since their wedding day, they walked side by side. That evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Sebastian returned to his study. On the desk lay both letters, the one she had written, and the one he had left unsent. He placed them together and sealed them in a small wooden box. He turned to her, standing by the door, her gown soft in the candlelight. "No more letters," he said quietly. "From now on, we speak." Arabella smiled, the faintest curve of her lips breaking the last of the distance between them. "Then speak, my lord," she said. "I am listening." Winter came early to Hawthorne Manor that year. Frost clung to the iron gates, and the bare oaks stood like sentinels guarding the estate's long and winding drive. Inside, fires burned in every hearth, and candles glowed against the deep chill. But warmth, true warmth, is not a thing one can summon by flame alone. For Lady Arabella and Duke Sebastian, the storm had passed. Yes, but what follows a storm is always quiet reckoning. Their reconciliation had begun in the stables, with rain and tears and a confession that trembled on both sides of forgiveness. Yet, forgiveness is never as swift as a kiss, nor as simple as an apology. It is slow measured, like the thaw of winter ground beneath the frost. Arabella stood in the music room that morning, her fingers lightly brushing the keys of the pianoforte. The melody she played was soft, uncertain, and beautiful in its hesitation, a song of questions, of tentative peace. She sensed him enter before he spoke. "You used to play that before supper," Sebastian said quietly. "I would listen from the hall." She didn't turn, though a faint smile ghosted across her lips. "You never entered." "I was a coward," he admitted. "Afraid that if I saw your eyes, I would remember what I had lost." Arabella paused, her hand hovering above the keys. "And now," he stepped closer, the firelight catching in his eyes. "Now I remember what I still have, if you will allow me." She exhaled softly, the music fading into silence. "I have allowed much, Sebastian, but forgiveness is not given, it is earned." He nodded, his voice low. "Then let me earn it." In the weeks that followed, the Duke set about doing what pride had prevented him from doing for years, learning her heart again. He began to accompany her on her morning rides, though he was no great admirer of cold winds. He shared breakfast with her in the east drawing-room instead of dining alone in his study. He asked questions, small ones at first, almost awkward: what she was reading, which garden she favored, whether she still painted in the afternoons. Each day, the walls between them grew thinner, the silences softer. And yet, the ghosts of 7 years are not so easily banished. One evening, as the snow began to fall, Arabella came upon Sebastian in the old gallery, a place she seldom visited. He stood before a portrait of his late father, the old Duke, whose stern eyes seemed to follow every movement. "I see you've found your reflection," she said lightly, though her tone held no mockery. He smiled faintly. "My father was a man of discipline, duty before all things." "And you followed him faithfully," she said, "perhaps too faithfully." He glanced at her. "You think duty my sin?" "I think pride your undoing," she replied gently. Sebastian sighed. "Perhaps they are the same thing." She stepped closer, her voice softening. "You spent years hiding behind titles and expectations. But I never married the Duke of Hawthorne. I married you, Sebastian, the man who used to read poetry by candlelight, who laughed when it was raining, who loved his horses more than his reputation." His jaw tightened. "That man died long ago." "No," she whispered. "You buried him. There's a difference." He turned away, staring at the falling snow outside the window. "You make forgiveness sound so simple." "It isn't," she said. "It is work. It is choosing to stay, even when leaving would be easier." She hesitated, then added softly, "And I am still here." He turned, his expression unguarded for the first time. "Oui, Arabella. After all I've done." Her gaze met his steady, luminous. "Because I once made a vow, and because, despite everything, I still see the man I loved." That night, for the first time in years, they dined together alone. The long table, usually symbolic of their distance, was shortened by candlelight and quiet laughter. He poured her wine himself, and when their hands brushed, it was no longer an accident. They spoke of small things, books, neighbors, the absurdity of London gossip, but beneath it ran something deeper, the delicate music of two hearts remembering how to speak in harmony. After dinner, as she rose to leave, he caught her wrist lightly. "Arabella," he said, his tone earnest, almost boyish. "Will you walk with me tomorrow? To the lake?" She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "In this weather?" "In any weather," he said softly. The next morning dawned pale and bright, the snow glittering like a field of diamonds. They walked together along the frozen path that led to the lake, their breaths forming clouds in the sharp air. The lake was frozen over, a perfect mirror of winter stillness. For a long time they said nothing, simply listening to the world's quiet. At last, Arabella spoke. "Do you remember our wedding day?" He smiled sadly. "Every detail. The lilies. Your mother crying, you refusing to look at me. I thought I was marrying duty," she said. "I did not realize I was marrying silence." He looked at her then, his voice low. "I thought I was protecting us both by saying nothing. I see now that silence is not kindness, it is cowardice dressed in restraint." She nodded, her breath trembling in the cold. "And yet, here we are, here we are, here we are," he echoed. They stood at the water's edge, the reflection of two figures side by side, one heart learning again, the other daring to trust. "Arabella," he said quietly, "there is something I have not yet said, something I have feared to speak, even now." She turned to him. "Then speak it." He hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket and drew out the small wooden box, the one containing both their letters. "These," he said, offering it to her. "Every word I could not say, every apology I failed to give." She took the box, her hands trembling as she opened it. Inside were both letters, sealed and bound with a simple ribbon. She traced the edges of the parchment, her throat tightening. "They belong to us both," he said softly. "But I would burn them, if you wished it." She looked up, tears glimmering in her eyes. "No," she said. "Let them remain, as proof that even silence can change." He smiled faintly. "Then let this winter be our beginning." She stepped closer, her gloved hand resting against his cheek. It already is. And there, beneath a sky heavy with snow, the Duke and Duchess of Hawthorne, once strangers bound by duty, finally stood as equals bound by choice. The first flakes began to fall again, settling gently upon his dark coat, upon her hair, upon the letters resting between them. That evening, as the manor lights glowed against the frost, Arabella wrote once more, not a letter this time, but a single line in her journal. He has begun to speak, and I, at last, have begun to listen. The Hawthorne estate was alight that evening, chandeliers blazing, crystal decanters gleaming, and violins whispering across the ballroom floor. But for all its grandeur, the night carried a weight heavier than gold or velvet, a silence that seemed to follow the Duke and Duchess wherever they went. It had been weeks since the ball at the Montrose estate, weeks of careful conversation, of stolen glances that burned longer than words could. Sebastian and Arabella had begun to exist in that delicate realm between civility and surrender, between restraint and longing. Yet tonight, everything trembled on the edge of change. Arabella had learned to master her smile in public, soft enough to charm, distant enough to protect her heart. But as she descended the grand staircase that evening, wearing a gown of pale blue silk that shimmered like moonlight, even she felt the tremor in her chest. Her eyes sought him before her thoughts allowed it. And there he was, the Duke of Hawthorne, in his black tailcoat and pristine cravat, standing near the window where the lamplight fell across his jawline. For once, he did not appear as the aloof nobleman the world admired. He looked human. Their eyes met, and the orchestra's tempo seemed to slow. "Your Grace," she greeted, her voice steady, but her pulse not. He bowed slightly. "You look radiant, my lady." It was the kind of compliment he had never dared to speak before, not in such a tone, not with such quiet reverence. As the evening unfolded, the room filled with laughter, conversation, and dance, but neither of them truly belonged to it. Every moment was a performance, every glance, a battle. At last, when the waltz began, he approached. "Will you grant me this dance?" Arabella hesitated, then placed her gloved hand in his. "If your Grace insists." When he drew her close, their fingers met, and something shifted. His hand rested lightly at her waist, hers upon his shoulder. The first step was cautious, but the second trembled with something dangerous. The crowd blurred. The music vanished into their heartbeat. For the first time in 7 months of marriage, Arabella allowed herself to lean just slightly into him. And Sebastian, the Duke known for restraint, forgot to breathe. When the waltz ended, he did not release her hand immediately. "Arabella." She looked up, startled by the sound of her name spoken so gently. He swallowed hard, his voice low. "I have been a fool. I thought distance was kindness, that keeping you at arm's length was mercy. But tonight," her heart pounded. "Your Grace, Sebastian," he corrected softly. "Just Sebastian, when we are alone." The words lingered like a promise neither of them yet knew how to keep. Later, when the guests had gone and the candles burned low, Arabella stood by the window of their shared chambers, the same chambers she had entered months ago as a stranger to her husband. The rain had begun outside, steady and quiet, drumming against the glass like a confession. She turned when she heard the door. He stood there, his expression shadowed by candlelight. "I cannot pretend any more," he said, stepping closer. "Every time you walk into a room, I forget my own name. I wanted to protect you from me, from the man I used to be, but it has only made us both miserable." Arabella's voice trembled. "And what would you have me do? Pretend as though our past never existed, that you did not leave me alone in this house for months?" "I would have you tell me the truth," he said simply. "Do you still wish to leave me, Arabella?" She looked at him for a long moment, at the man she had once hated, then pitied, and finally begun to understand. "I do not know," she whispered. "But I no longer wish to hate you." His breath caught. "Then perhaps there is hope." He stepped closer, slow enough for her to retreat if she chose, but she did not. The distance between them vanished like mist. His hand lifted to her cheek, tentative, reverent. For one heartbeat, neither moved. Then, as if drawn by gravity, his lips brushed hers, not in passion, but in apology, in longing, in the quiet ache of two lonely souls finally finding their reflection. When she pulled away, her eyes glistened. "You waited 7 months to do that. she whispered. He smiled faintly, his thumb still tracing the edge of her jaw. "Forgive me," he murmured. "It took me that long to learn how to deserve it." And though the rain still fell, for the first time in their marriage, the house did not feel cold. The dawn came soft and pale, like a secret whispered by the sky itself. A thin mist hung over the Hawthorne estate, wrapping the ancient oaks and ivy-covered walls in a silvery stillness. Inside the house, a quiet peace, fragile, tentative, and utterly new, rested between the Duke and Duchess. For 7 months, their union had been a cage of formality. But that night, the night of rain and truth, something had changed. Something gentle had begun to live where cold silence once reigned. Arabella stirred in the faint light, her gaze falling upon the Duke seated by the fire, coat discarded, his head bowed as though in prayer. He had not slept. "Sebastian," she said softly. He looked up at once, surprise flickering in his tired eyes. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't," she murmured, drawing the shawl closer around her shoulders. "But I dare say you frightened the fire half to death by staring at it so severely." He smiled, faintly but real. "I was thinking." "That seems dangerous," she teased, her voice quieter now. He rose, approaching slowly. "It is, when the thoughts are of you." Arabella looked away, flustered, though the smallest smile curved her lips. "Your Grace has grown dreadfully sentimental." "I have grown honest," he corrected gently. "Something you asked of me long ago." The words lingered between them like perfume in the morning air. There had been tenderness last night, hesitant, fragile, but real. Now there was the question of what must follow, forgiveness or regret. Arabella turned toward the window, watching the sun's reflection glitter upon the wet earth. "When I first came to this house, I swore I would never feel anything for you. I thought you proud, cruel even." "And I was," he admitted. "I built walls because I feared what waited beyond them. I thought love was weakness." She glanced at him, her eyes soft but steady. "And now?" He said, stepping closer. "I think it is the only thing that makes strength bearable." The simplicity of his words struck her harder than all his previous eloquence. There was a knock upon the door, timid, uncertain. "Your Grace," came Mrs. Penberry's voice, the housekeeper. "The household awaits your orders for the day." Sebastian hesitated, glancing to Arabella. "Tell them," she said quietly, "that the Duke will breakfast with his wife in the garden." He looked at her, astonished, not by her words, but by the calm warmth with which she spoke them. For months she had dined alone in silence. "Yes, my lady," Mrs. Penberry said softly through the door, perhaps smiling behind her hand. When the sound of footsteps faded, Arabella turned back to her husband. "You should not look so surprised," she said. "It is your house. I merely live here." "No," he replied, reaching for her hand. "It is our house, if you will let it be." They took breakfast under the pale autumn sun, surrounded by roses heavy with dew. The air smelled faintly of lavender and earth, and the silver teapot gleamed on the white linen tablecloth. For a time, they spoke of simple things, the weather, the tenants, the new foal in the stables. But beneath every word, there pulsed the quiet rhythm of something reborn. Finally, Arabella set down her teacup and said, "Do you mean to tell me what it was that changed you? Or must I continue guessing?" He hesitated. "I read your letters." She froze. "My letters?" "The ones you wrote to your sister, years ago, before our marriage." Her cheeks colored. "You had no right, I know," he said, his tone grave. "But I found them one night when the loneliness became unbearable. You wrote of your hopes, your fears, and of how you never wished to marry for duty." Her eyes glistened. "And yet, you let me." He nodded, shame softening his voice. "Because I thought I could protect us both from disappointment." "But your words, they reminded me what it means to live honestly. And I realized I have kept you captive when you were meant to be my freedom." For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the soft hum of the breeze filled the air. When she finally answered, her voice trembled. "Sebastian, I do not know if I can forgive everything, but I can try, if you promise never again to hide behind silence." He took her hand, pressing it against his chest. "Then I promise you my truth, even when it is ugly. And I ask humbly, for a chance to earn yours. Arabella looked at him, truly looked, and for the first time saw not the cold Duke, but the man who had finally learned to love without armor. Her heart, long imprisoned, opened like the morning sky. In the weeks that followed, the Hawthorne estate changed in quiet, invisible ways. The servants whispered less and smiled more. The gardens were tended again. The Duke was seen walking beside his Duchess at the village fair, his hand resting lightly over hers, not as possession, but as presence. And one evening, as the last of the summer light faded into gold, Arabella found herself standing beside Sebastian at the terrace. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "The marriage?" She nodded. He smiled faintly. "Every regret I ever had brought me to this moment. So no, my love, not anymore." Her breath caught at the words "my love," the first he had spoken them aloud. She leaned into him, and for once there was no hesitation between them. The breeze stirred her hair, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. That night, they danced alone in the candlelit hall, to music that only they could hear. Two souls who had been strangers, bound by duty, now united by choice. As the world outside fell into darkness, the house glowed with warmth, the kind that is not loud or sudden, but deep, patient, and everlasting. In time, the Ton would call them the most devoted couple in London, though neither cared much for titles anymore. For love, once reluctant, had found its home at last in the heart of the Duke who had learned to kneel, and the lady who had learned to stay.